Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President-elect Donald J. Trump.
Trump won 312 electoral votes in the 2024 presidential election, reclaiming the White House and showing that his influence over American politics remains strong. However, winning was just the beginning. His actions afterwards seemed to threaten the very foundations of American democracy. Now, the real question isn't whether Trump will push the limits of power, it is whether he's following a path similar to those taken by some leaders before him. Are the patterns we are seeing mere political strategy, or are they the warning signs of something much more dangerous? Throughout history, leaders who rise to great power often do so not just through policies or governance, but through something far more commanding: an undeniable presence. A persona so grand, so larger than life, that the movement they create becomes inseparable from the individual at its center. From Mussolini's staged rallies to Stalin's statues towering across various Soviet cities, history has shown how a leader's personal brand can become their most powerful weapon. This influence shapes how nations function and how citizens view their government, whether for good or bad. Trump, now the President of the United States and leader of the free world, has undeniably mastered this kind of influence. When he rode the golden escalator of Trump Tower in 2015 to announce his presidential bid, it wasn't just the start of a campaign, but the beginning of a political movement. And unlike traditional politicians, Trump did not rely on great speeches or scripted talking points. He tapped into something more profound. He cast himself as the outsider, the billionaire businessman who told it like it was, disregarded political correctness, and embodied the rage of millions of Americans. His speeches were not just political, they were impromptu, interactive, and deliberately incendiary. This tactic was no different from how Mussolini positioned himself in Italy nearly a century ago. The Italian dictator built his popularity by delivering emotional speeches and telling his followers that they were part of something bigger than themselves. He used rhetoric to position himself as the only leader who could restore national pride. Trump, even though in a democratic regime, attempted the same card, presenting himself as the only genuine warrior against the corrupt political elite. Whether through his catchphrases like "Make America Great Again" or his willingness to attack the Washington establishment, he made himself the center of any political conversation. However, his weapon of choice set Trump apart from past leaders: social media. Unlike political figures of the past who relied on state-controlled newspapers or radio broadcasts, Trump had direct, unfiltered access to millions through Twitter. He didn't need intermediaries to shape his message. He dictated the conversation in real time by reacting instantly to criticism, attacking opponents, and crafting a narrative that often surprised traditional media. His tweets set the day's news cycle, ensuring that his voice, perspective, and words dominated American political discourse. Mussolini also understood this tactic very well, but it required large public appearances and state-controlled messaging in his time. He ensured that his face appeared in newspapers daily and his speeches dominated radio broadcasts. The goal was always to drown out the opposition and make his voice the one Italians trusted the most. Trump, who operates within a democracy, didn't need to control the press to achieve a similar effect. He simply made his presence so dominant that even those who opposed him couldn't ignore him. Controversy became his ally because he knew that in a media-driven world, positive or negative attention was the ultimate currency. His political rallies became spectacles that mirrored the large-scale events of historic strongmen. The energy, the chanting crowds, and the repeated slogans all contributed to an atmosphere beyond politics and became something more profound. For many supporters, backing Trump wasn't just about policy, it was personal. They saw him as their voice, their champion against a system they felt had left them behind. This is the foundation of a personality cult, when a leader is no longer just a politician, but the embodiment of a movement. However, what makes the American system different is that counterbalances exist. Despite Trump's frequent remarks on journalists and his branding of critical coverage as fake news, the press in the United States remains free to a large extent. unlike historical figures like Stalin, who controlled state newspapers, or Hitler, whose propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, ensured a single narrative was spread, Trump did not have the singular power to silence the media. Major news networks, newspapers, and independent journalists continue to challenge his claims and investigate his administration. Even as trust in traditional media platforms declined among his supporters, the American press remains one of the strongest counterweights to his influence, ensuring that no single narrative can dominate unchallenged. Through his mastery of the media, Trump continues to build an unshakable narrative. He positions himself as the only leader who truly fights for the people, the only voice they can trust. But in a democracy, power is never absolute, and the press, the courtrooms, and the opposition party remain active, proving that while a leader may dominate the conversation, they sometimes do not hold complete control. Not too many dictatorships start with a military coup. More often, they begin with a slow, deliberate effort to weaken the institutions designed to keep leaders in check. Democracies don't fall in a single movement. They erode when courts, intelligence agencies, and electoral systems are no longer seen as independent. This pattern has played out in numerous countries, from Hugo Chavez in Venezuela to Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. In the United States, Trump's approach to power has raised concerns about whether he is following a similar path. His systematic dismantling of the judiciary marked Chavez's rise in Venezuela. He claimed the courts were riddled with corruption run by elites conspiring against people's will. His solution was simply to replace them with his loyalists. Over time, Venezuela's courts no longer acted as an independent branch of government, but instead rubber-stamped every decision Chavez made. While operating in a completely different system, Trump has exhibited some of these tendencies in how he interacts with the judiciary. During his first term, when the court foiled his immigration bans and later invalidated his election challenges, his response was not one to respect judicial independence. Instead, he brazenly attacked the legitimacy of judges, tagging those who opposed him as Obama judges and suggesting that the legal system was biased against him. He tended to imply that negative court decisions were not constitutional rulings, but politically motivated acts of sabotage. Beyond the courts, Trump has also raised many suspicions about America's intelligence agencies, portraying the FBI and CIA as corrupt institutions that once worked against him. This is a playbook that has been used by a few autocratic leaders across the world. Recall when Erdogan once framed Turkish security agencies as enemies of the state, taking out high-ranking officials and replacing them with loyalists. Trump's public rejection of intelligence reports, sometimes siding with foreign adversaries over his security officials, has raised alarms about how his administration views national security institutions. However, the American system has not allowed these attempts to go unchecked. During Trump's first term, judges struck down attempts to limit immigration beyond constitutional authority. His claims of widespread election fraud back in 2020 were rejected by the Supreme Court, including some of the justices he appointed. This shows a key distinction. While Trump may challenge institutions, he does not have unchecked control over them. For all his attacks on it, the judicial system remains an independent force that has consistently blocked his overreach. Perhaps the most concerning aspect of Trump's approach to governance is his framing of political opposition. While Trump has not resorted to some extreme measures as witnessed with Chavez, Stalin, or Erdogan of Turkey, his rhetoric has followed a similar pattern of suggesting that political rivals are not just wrong, but part of a larger criminal conspiracy. He has repeatedly suggested that the justice system should go after his opponents. But once again, the American system has held firm against this narrative. In 2020, Republican election officials in Georgia publicly refuted his fraud claims after his defeat to Joe Biden, ensuring that the democratic process remained intact. Even within his party, Trump has faced resistance, as not all Republicans have aligned with his more extreme measures. Figures like Senator Mitt Romney and former Vice President Mike Pence have spoken out against attempts to undermine democratic institutions. This internal pushback suggests that while Trump may challenge the norms of democracy, the system has proven resilient.
Well, we have some of the dumbest leaders in the world. We have losers. We have losers.
They're losers. They're just losers.
We have very stupid people.
Authoritarian leaders in the past have not risen to power by uniting people, but by polarizing them. This method, known as the politics of division, has been a successful tool for consolidating power for centuries. Stalin mastered it in Soviet Russia. Mao turned it into a movement during China's Cultural Revolution. In modern America, Trump seems to be wielding it with remarkable precision. The method is simple: rally your base, project fear, and frame every opponent as a danger to the nation. When done effectively, this becomes a self-sustaining cycle where followers believe that questioning the leader is an act of treason. Stalin's version of this was brutal. In the 1930s, he unleashed what became known as the Great Purge, which was a way of convincing Soviet citizens that traitors were hiding in plain sight, waiting to sabotage the communist state. No one was safe, as school teachers, military officers, and longtime party members were accused of disloyalty. The secret police, the NKVD, executed thousands under false charges. Stalin's greatest weapon was not the use of extreme force, it was fear. By making every citizen paranoid, he ensured no one dared challenge him. Though Trump's move has been much less drastic than the moves made by Stalin, the strategy behind it is the same. He consistently framed his political rivals and Democrats as not merely opponents, but threats to the survival of what America represents. The press? He called them the enemy of the people. Government officials who challenge his decisions? He labeled them the deep state. Democratic leaders are either crooked or outrightly corrupt. Even within his party, those who fail his loyalty test are cast out, labeled as rhinos, which stands for Republicans in name only. Just like Stalin's purge was a warning to others, Trump's public humiliation of disloyal Republicans sends a clear message. If you are not fully with me, you are against me. During China's Cultural Revolution, Mao Zedong weaponized youth loyalty by turning students into enforcers of ideological purity. Millions of Red Guards publicly denounced their teachers, friends, and even family members, believing they were rooting out threats to the revolution. In America, Trump supporters were not mobilized into physical purges, but the social and political consequences of opposing him seem severe. Republican officials who refused to back his election fraud claims faced primary challenges, career-ending isolation, and in some cases, threats to their safety. Yet, while Trump has succeeded in fostering some level of political division, the strength of American institutions has so far prevented him from fully controlling the system. Unlike Stalin, Mao, or even modern leaders like Erdogan, Trump does not have unchecked power over the state, and one of the biggest counterweights to his strategy has been the resilience of the Republican Party itself. While many GOP leaders have aligned with Trump on many issues, there has also been strong internal pushback. Not every Republican has followed his lead blindly. Politicians like former Vice President Mike Pence, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, and a few others have been resolute opponents of his most extreme demands, particularly on the 2020 election. McConnell, for instance, vocally condemned Trump's actions on January 6, 2021 as a shameful abdication of responsibility. More recently, in his second term, while Trump has a loyal base within the GOP, internal resistance remains a checkmate to his full party domination. Democracies are built on the idea that no single person should wield unchecked power. Institutions, laws, and checks and balances exist to prevent any leader from ruling by decree. But history has repeatedly shown that these safeguards are only as strong as the leader's willingness to respect them. When a determined leader sees these limitations as obstacles rather than principles, the shift toward authoritarian rule doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small, seemingly insignificant steps until one day, democracy is a shadow of what it once was. Vladimir Putin of Russia provides a clear example of how a leader can expand authority while maintaining the illusion of democracy. When he first took office in 2000, he worked within Russia's constitutional framework. But over time, he slowly dismantled those institutional barriers, weakened judicial independence, and restructured the political system in his favor. By the time he reached his second decade in power, elections still took place, but the outcomes were already decided long before a single vote was cast. His authority had become absolute. All the while, the illusion of a democratic process remained intact. In many ways, Trump has tested the limits of executive power like no president before him. In just a few hours after his inauguration, he leaned heavily on executive orders to bypass several congressional approvals, signing over 50 of them on his first day in office and during his second term. While previous presidents have used executive orders to enact policy, Trump took it further by pushing through policies lacking legislative backing. One of the most controversial moments of his first term was in 2019, when he declared a national emergency at the US-Mexico border to secure funding for his border wall, despite rejection from Congress. It is not a novel strategy, as Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan took the same path after an attempt to overthrow him in a coup d'etat attempt years ago in 2016. After declaring a state of emergency, he went about identifying opposition government members, arresting political opponents, and ruling by decree for 2 years. By the time he lifted the emergency measures, Turkey's democracy had transformed into a system where power was concentrated almost entirely in his hands. Unlike Turkey or Russia, whose leaders could act without opposition, Trump's moves are met with resistance from multiple fronts, particularly within the US court system. For example, when Trump declared the border emergency in his first term, both Congress and the courts pushed back. The House and Senate passed a bipartisan resolution to block his emergency declaration, though Trump ultimately vetoed it. Most importantly, the courts consistently overturned his executive orders, such as trying to revoke environmental protections, undo the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Act, and implement travel bans. In his second term, his increased executive powers will certainly be subjected to even more legal questioning, showing the judiciary system is still a forceful check on his authority. Other than emergency powers, Trump had also made previous attempts to belittle congressional oversight. At the beginning of his first term, he ignored subpoenas, directed key officials of his administration not to testify, and dismissed any inquiry into his time in office as political. This effectively undercut Congress's ability to hold the presidency accountable. His actions incited outrage worldwide, but even as Trump continued to dig in, courts compelled senior officials to testify, such as the former White House counsel Don McGahn, who was subpoenaed to appear before Congress to testify. The rulings reminded all that though Trump sought to avoid oversight, there remained legal remedies to thwart his attempts. Perhaps the most alarming indicator of his approach to power was his repeated suggestion that he should serve more than 2 terms. While these remarks were often delivered with light regard, Trump believed term limits, like other democratic norms, were just obstacles to be challenged. This is similar to tactics used by leaders like Putin, who successfully altered Russia's constitution to extend his rule until at least 2036. However, unlike in Russia, Trump faces an American system that has upheld the 22nd Amendment, which strictly limits US presidents to 2 terms.
How tough is it to take property from an elderly woman?
Let me talk. Quiet.
How tough is it?
A lot of times.
The ability to control information is one of the most powerful tools any leader can wield. In every system that shifts towards total leadership, one of the first targets is always the press. If a leader can make the people doubt independent journalism and instead rely solely on state-approved messaging, they gain an unrivaled advantage in shaping public perception. History has seen this pattern repeat itself over and over, from Adolf Hitler's control of the German media to Rodrigo Duterte's relentless crackdown on journalists in the Philippines. The Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels during the Nazi regime, systematically eliminated independent voices. The regime tightly controlled many newspapers, radio stations, and entertainment media, and any journalist or publication that contradicted the regime's official stance was labelled Lügenpresse, meaning lying press, and was aggressively silenced. While Trump has not outright shut down any media organisation, his relentless war against the press follows a strikingly similar pattern in pushing down independent journalism. From the moment he announced his first presidential campaign in 2015 to his re-election bid and eventual victory in 2024, he has consistently framed major media outlets as corrupt, biased, and enemies of the people. His rallies were often preceded by media-bashing chants echoing his fake news slogan. Cable news channels such as CNN, The New York Times, and The Washington Post have been in his sights in his rhetoric, with his followers often labeling any unfavorable reporting as fake or politically motivated. The former president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, took this strategy even further. His administration systematically targeted independent news organizations, most notably Rappler, an investigative outlet that exposed corruption and human rights violations. During his time in office, Duterte labeled journalists as spies and sons of the B-word, and his government used legal actions to threaten press freedom. Eventually, his administration went beyond rhetoric, shutting down media organizations and arresting journalists who refused to comply. Trump, on the other hand, has not gone as far as jailing journalists, but his administration has used legal and institutional pressure to weaken the press. Despite Trump's rhetoric, major news organizations around the country continue to operate and investigative journalism remains alive, uncovering major stories that challenge his administration. What sets Trump apart from authoritarian figures is that he did not need state-run media to control his narrative. Instead, he created his own alternative media ecosystem through social media. Hitler controlled newspapers and radio stations. Duterte flooded Facebook with government-backed propaganda. However, Trump has built a direct communication line with millions through Twitter. But when Trump was suspended from Facebook and Twitter following the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, it seemed like a harsh blow to his authority. Rather than allowing the media to regain political narrative, he doubled down on his messaging. He launched Truth Social in 2022, where his supporters could interact without mainstream fact-checking or interference from the opposition. Despite his repeated remarks about the press, Trump has been unable to silence journalism in the United States, as news organizations continue to report on his presidency with scrutiny and investigation. Let's take a look at what has characterized his election moves since he became active in US politics. Elections are both the greatest opportunity and threat to a leader seeking to maintain power. Winning maintains authority, while losing can spell the end of a political career. Yet Donald Trump has done what only a few in American history have done: returned to the White House after a previous defeat. Since losing in 2020, he spent 4 years working relentlessly to push the idea that the election was stolen, reshaping the beliefs of millions of Americans about the legitimacy of the electoral process. His victory in 2024 was more than a comeback. It was a total exposure of how American democracy operates. Throughout history, powerful rulers have used their past defeats as an excuse to tighten their grip. After temporarily handing over the presidency in 2008 due to constitutional limitations, Vladimir Putin returned with an even tighter grip on the country, amending laws to extend presidential terms and systematically weakening the powers of the opposition. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez revised election rules and government structures, making it nearly impossible for political rivals to challenge him effectively.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
From the moment Trump was sworn in for his second term in January 2025, his administration has aggressively sought to restructure key institutions. However, the most surprising and ambitious move of his second term was the creation of the Department of Government Efficiency, with Elon Musk appointed as its head. On the surface, DOGE was introduced as a revolutionary effort to eliminate government waste, streamline bureaucracy, and cut inefficiency across federal agencies. However, critics have raised concerns that its true purpose could be consolidating executive power by placing oversight of government functions under individuals more aligned with Trump's vision. Trump's administration argues that cutting down excessive government spending and holding agencies accountable is necessary. However, opponents worry that this level of executive oversight over federal operations could give the White House too much control over agencies that are supposed to remain independent. The approach bears similarities to Daniel Ortega's policies in Nicaragua, where election rules were restricted to eliminate opposition threats and consolidate power indefinitely. However, unlike Ortega and other leaders who completely dismantled their opposition, Trump faces significant institutional resistance within the US political system. The Supreme Court has ruled against him in key cases, including decisions that upheld state election laws and rejected claims of widespread voter fraud. Even within his party, not all Republicans have fully embraced his election policies, as several high-profile GOP figures have pushed back against extreme measures, arguing that election laws must remain fair and transparent. As of 2025, independent courts, election officials, and bipartisan resistance within Congress continue to serve as barriers to absolute power. As Trump starts his second term, the focus isn't just on his leadership style, but how he will influence the future elections in America. If history has taught us anything, leaders who return to power after defeat rarely leave things up to chance again. If you found this video thought-provoking, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching.